In this video, we're going to do a short overview of my mixing console. We'll just use one of the channel strips and work down it, because once you know what one channel strip does, you know what they all do. So we'll start at the top and we'll work our way down. So at the top we have our XLR inputs. These are a balanced input. But we also have an optional line-in. Now you can't use both at the same time. It's either XLR or line-in. Line-in would normally be from something like a CD player or some such device. But generally speaking, it's my key socket on the XLR, because these feeds would all be coming from the stage on your multi-core Snake. The next two sockets down are your send and return for your inserts. Now some desks have a single I/O or input-output socket, which is a tip ring sleeve 1/4" jack. This uses two independent tip and sleeve 1/4" jacks, one for the send, one for the return, to send off to anything on your effects rack to do an independent insert on a channel, other than additional to anything you might have on a group insert further down the desk. Okay, so the next button down, as mentioned on the video for the rack system, is the 48 volt phantom power switch. As you can see, each channel has its own switch to switch in or out the phantom power on that particular channel. The next item down is your input gain dial. This determines the amount of signal being fed from your source into the desk for mixing. Generally speaking, you would feed this up until such time as the signal was peaking, and then you'd pull it off slightly, and then you would adjust your output using your fader further down the desk. The next button down is quite important on a lot of the bigger consoles. This is called a pad button, and basically if your incoming signal is too powerful or too hot, you can use the pad button to cut the incoming signal by 26 dB. It sounds quite a lot of cut, but because it's an exponential curve, upwards and downwards, 26 dB isn't actually that much to cut. Okay, so the next section down is the EQ section. Now you remember in the rack system there was 31 bands of EQ. Obviously you can't fit that onto a mixing desk, so some desks will have what they call parametric, some will have semi-parametric. This desk has what we call shelving EQ, i.e. like your home stereo, which just has a treble and a bass frequency dials for your equalizer. This just has 4 dials, so we have a high mid range, a low mid range and a low. They're at fixed frequencies, so starting from the low upwards we've got 60 Hertz, then we've got 330 Hertz, then we've got 1.8 kilohertz, and then we've got 12 kilohertz as the set frequencies that we can cut or boost in either direction to achieve the desired tone on that particular input. Semi-parametric ones may have, on the mid, rather than a low and a high mid, they may have an adjustable frequency that you can then cut or boost. Fully parametrics will have, on every single channel of frequency, will have a rangefinder and then a cut or boost for that range on every single section of the EQ. But this particular desk just has 4 shelving EQs to tune the channel with. Obviously this is in conjunction with what you've done with your front of house EQ to EQ the room before you start EQing and sound checking the artists on stage. Okay, the next section is the auxiliary section. This is quite important. We have 6 auxiliary channels. 1 and 2 are permanently pre-fader on this desk, which means anything you do with the fader up or down will not affect the output from the auxiliary channel to wherever the signal's going. Aux 3 and 4 are switchable, and I'll show you the switch for that later on in the video, between pre or post fader. Auxes 5 and 6 are permanently post fader, which means any adjustment you make on the fader will affect the output from these auxiliary channels. Generally speaking, pre-fader would be for your monitor sends, and post-fader would be for any effects. So the more you punch a signal up, the more effect is added to it further down the signal chain. Here we have our group buttons. So group 1 and 2, group 3 and 4, group 5 and 6, group 7 and 8. Now, if you leave your pan dial central, so it's centered between left and right signal output, whichever button you select on your groups, it will be sent to both of those groups. If we only want to send the signal to, say, group 5, we press 5 and 6, but 5 is left and 6 is right. So we pan fully to the left, and all the signal from that channel is being sent to subgroup 5 further down the mixer, which we'll get to shortly. Okay. You also have the option, using the white button here, to send the signal direct to the left-right outputs. Generally speaking, when you're mixing a band, you will use the subgroups because it's easier to control, say, 8 to 10 channels of drums with one subgroup fader rather than trying to adjust 8 to 10 channel faders all at the same time. It's easier to turn one channel up or down on one fader. So we then come down and we have our mute button. Does what it says, it mutes the channel. Any signal coming in is not fed to either the group or the left-right out. We then have what's called our PFL, or pre-fade listen. This is where this is the button you will use in conjunction with your gain trim, and on the other end of the desk is a set of LEDs which will tell you when the signal is being clipping or the signal input is too high. So you use your pre-fade listen in conjunction with your gain trim to set your input level to a level that will not damage the rest of your system. Okay, and then finally we have our faders. You'll see on the desk that numbers start at 0 here, go up to +3 here, but then come down to infinity or 0, absolute nothing. It's something that's always been done on mixers. The unity gain, or 0, has always been set kind of in the middle or just above middle. Most mixers are normally operated somewhere in this area. Some schools of thought say when you set your desk up, set all your mixers at 0 and adjust your gain trim to get your desired levels. I personally prefer to set my gain trim at maximum that I can have and then adjust my output level from the fader itself. Okay, so this is the subgroup section we spoke about earlier. As you can see, there are 8 subgroup channels, groups 1 through 8. Start at the top. We have an assignable button for left right, which means when this button is depressed, anything we adjust on the fader is sent to the master left right outs. These two faders here are your left and your right to send the signal that you've mixed across the rest of the board to your main front of house speakers through the EQ and the crossover. Okay, so we have the pan left and right, which generally speaking will be left central, because if you've used the groups the way they're meant to be used, i.e. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, using the pans to create 8 subgroups, you will then want to send those subgroups to both left and right channels. Okay, so we leave the pans central. Further down we have another mute button and we have another PFL button, so you can actually pre-fade listen the entire group, be it drums or vocals or guitars or whatever. Okay, so that is the entire there, and then as I said earlier, it's easier to mix one subgroup of drums here than to try and mix 10 or so channels of independent channels of drums further down the mixing desk. And the same with vocals. You may only want to have, say, drums here, say backing vocals here, but you may want to have the lead vocal on a separate fader, so that if necessary you can increase the lead vocal, or you can bring the background vocals up to create good harmonies. Same with your guitars or keyboards. You may want to have 2 or 3 different keyboards if your keyboard player uses a panning effect. Then you may want to use 2 keyboards or 2 groups for keyboards to create that panned effect, in which case you will then dial out your pan buttons. Okay, so here we come back to subgroup outs and your auxiliaries. As we stated earlier, 1 and 2 are pre-fader, 3 and 4 are switchable pre or post, and 5 and 6 is post fader. So we actually have our master out volumes here for the 6 auxiliaries. Generally speaking, I will set these at unity gain, which is normally around about between 12 and 1 o'clock on the dial. Set that at that, and then we actually mix in the dial on the respective channel of whatever we want to send to that auxiliary. So 5 and 6, again, we will set at unity gain, normally around about 12 o'clock. These will be used to feed in the effects for reverb and delay for vocals. That is purely all those channels will be used for, and we can then feed that signal down into the channel strip here. We can send it to left and right so that we can actually control the level of the reverb and delay from these 2 faders here before it gets sent back down to the master left right outs. And obviously in between songs, when the lead singer is talking or someone's talking on stage, you can actually mute those 2 channels so you don't get that excessive reverb and delay coming from someone speaking on stage. And again, we've got the left right pan, but they will all just be left central to a center left right mix. Okay, so this section of the desk deals with inputs, outputs for aux effects and returns. So to start off with, we have 8 group out sockets, because this desk can also be used for studio work. So you would use your group outs to send your group signals off to an 8-track mixer recorder. The next 2 sockets down are aux out, aux in. The aux in I never use. I use the aux out because that is the signal that gets sent from the desk to the monitor EQs and then down the snake to the monitors on stage, and that is controlled by how much you dial in here and how much you dial in on the particular channel strip of whatever you're sending to that monitor send. So the first 4 are my monitor sends. We have a send and return. This is basically the same as the send return on the channels. It's a send and return for external FX, and this is where we insert compressors or FX onto each particular group of channels. So for instance, if this is the vocal channel, the vocal subgroup, we insert compressor here, we get to the last 2 subgroups. These are the vocal effects, so reverb and delay. Again, send and return, sends it out, comes back in, gets fed into the faders and sent to the left right out. Right, last couple of bits. First of all, on the far right hand side of the mixing desk, we have an XLR socket for a talkback mic. This is so that you can talk to the artists on stage through the monitors when you're talking them through the sound check, and we have a press to talk button here. So unless that button is depressed, the mic that you've got plugged in here will not be active. We have here the PFL meter or the AFL meter. Remember when I said about the PFL buttons down here, when you can see the input gain or the output signal being fed. Ideally, it wants to be kept around the 0 dB. If it starts creeping up towards the 3, or more importantly up towards the 6 with red lights, you know the signal is too hot and you need to pull back the incoming signal from the sound source so that you don't damage both your system and, more importantly, your amps and speakers. Okay, we have a button here that says meter PFL. Now, when the button is up, it is AFL. So the signal that's being fed here on the meter is the amount of signal being sent out to your front of house speakers. When the button is depressed, that means the meter is in pre-fade listen mode. So any channel you press the PFL button on, the signal for that channel will be fed into the meter here, so you can see the level of signal that that channel is producing. Okay, if we come up the top here, this button here is AUX 3.4 pre-fade. So as I said before, auxiliaries channels 3 and 4 are either pre or post fader on this desk. When the button is up, the channel is post fader. If the button is down, the channels are pre-fader. So that is the position I have them in for using auxiliaries 3 and 4 as monitors. Okay, we have a PFL mix, so I can mix all my PFLs and dial this in and send them to a set of headphones, so I can listen to a particular channel without getting overspill from other noises on stage. I can listen to that one particular channel in my headphones to see how it sounds. Okay, button here, this is the talk back level for this mic. So when the button is up, it goes to auxiliary 1 and 2. I cannot talk to auxiliaries 3 and 4 using the talk back. It can only go to auxiliaries 1 and 2 because they are the predetermined fixed pre-fader channels. When it's going down, it goes to left and right, so I can actually then talk to the audience through the front of house speakers. Okay, and that is basically it down here. And the final section of the desk is the outs. So we have our mono out, if you're only using a mono system. This is the socket for the power supply coming from the front of house rack. We have our left and right balanced outputs on XLRs. We also have jack outputs, which is an unbalanced output. We have a plus 4 dB output or a minus 10 dB output. If you're working in a really small environment, you may want to not use the XLRs, but use the minus 10 dB. Medium-sized outputs, such as larger pubs, you may want to use the 4 dB, but generally, for most venues, you'll use the XLR out because that is a proper balanced output. You'll notice below here as well, as with all the other channels across the entire desk, we have a send and return. This is where I used to insert a graphic equalizer or a compressor on the front of house. I now just use from the output to the EQ, then to the crossover. So these channels are not used at all now on my desk. We also have power indicators here. So we have the main power supply and the main negative, auxiliary power supply, auxiliary negative, and then we have the 48 volt. The three that will always be lit are main POS, main neg, and 48 volt if you've got the phantom power switched on. The other two will only be used if you've got a powered insert on one of your auxiliary channels, which I never have, so those two are never ever lit. And that is basically it on the last section of the desk. So just finally, there is the desk in all its glory. As you can see, it looks quite complicated, but as I've broken down each individual section for you, hopefully it doesn't make it look too daunting for anyone looking to get into PA and looking at a big desk such as this one, because you know what each channel does. Thanks for watching.